Finovate showcases cutting-edge banking and financial technology through a global conference series featuring short-form demos and thought leadership. Now, the conversation continues on the Finovate podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Finovate podcast. Joining me today, we have Jinee Ellis, a financial crimes manager at Wells Fargo. Jinee, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Hi, thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Excellent. So to kick things off, can you give us just a little bit of background on your perspective on the security and fraud space coming from a big bank like Wells Fargo?
Sure. What I would say is even before some of these recent events with COVID-19, fraud attacks have been inevitable and on the rise for businesses. And there's a variety of different reports and surveys that show that the majority of organizations have been affected by fraud. So a big part of what I do is focus on driving fraud education so organizations can be aware of common fraud risks and best practices to mitigate fraud.
Excellent. Well, as you said, that's a full-time job before COVID-19 started making the rounds. Obviously, since the virus has spread, there's been an uptick in fraud and financial crime, and it has to do with a couple of different factors. One of them, so many people working from home makes it much more difficult than ever before for companies to maintain a tight security around their workforce. I know this is something that a lot of companies are thinking about, and they're taking steps to try and combat this with things like training courses. I had to take one of those kind of click through a series of slides and answer 10 questions at the end. But it seems like the scope of the potential problem that we're facing here is bigger than that. Can you talk about what some of these threats are that people should really be aware of in a COVID-19 environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So as an example, there are many of us who are sitting here at home still sheltering in place. And as you can imagine, we're all seeking updated information on COVID-19 on a daily basis. So cybercriminals are using this knowledge to increase phishing and malware attacks. So as an example, they're sending out fake email messages that are notifying employees of a positive COVID-19 test within their organization. Now, if you're an employee who's receiving this type of email, it's apparent why somebody might be compelled to open one of these emails. But, there's also been fraudulent emails claiming to originate from World Health Organization or the CDC. And if an employee opens those fake emails and clicks on one of those embedded attachments or links, they could really put themselves at risk of downloading and installing malware, which opens the door to a lot of different fraud schemes. The other thing I would sort of mention is you talked about people working from home and some of the increased risks. This can really create new opportunities for fraudsters to hack users or organizations. So one example that's been in the recent news lately has been around hacking video conference calls. The prevalence and dependency that we now have on video conferencing platforms and other remote collaboration tools is really creating opportunities for cybercriminals to figure out new ways that they can infiltrate organizations.
Yeah, certainly a couple of different angles there. I think one of the ones that's most interesting to me to just kind of pick out is so much of this type of fraud relies on making you as an email user interested enough in a subject matter to click on a link that you don't understand. And when you've got something which is really compelling, like, someone in your organization has tested positive for COVID-19, it's really difficult to resist that temptation. And I think that's something that a lot of fraudsters kind of count on. But one of the questions that I had here, are we talking primarily about risk for kind of corporations or risk for individuals? Where's sort of the greater risk lie in your perspective?
Quite honestly, I think it's a combination of both. If you think about corporations, really, their front line is their employees. So,
Sure,
at the end of the day, I think, protecting a corporation is really around educating all of the individual employees too, who can ensure that collectively they're protecting the company as well as using good cybersecurity hygiene and, not clicking on those fraudulent emails and falling victim to some type of phishing email attack.
Yeah, well, that's I think a good point as well. One of the things that we've talked about so far, we've talked about phishing, we've talked about malware. These are obviously types of fraud which have existed previously. Are we seeing now, dangerous new types of fraud, or is it really just an increase in fraudulent behavior that we were already sort of generally aware of, or a combination of the two? I'd love your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. The current COVID-19 situation is certainly making more organizations more vulnerable to existing fraud threats so that they're falling victim to them on a more frequent basis. But I think fraudsters are really also being creative and finding new ways to exploit the pandemic. The example we just talked about earlier with the hacking video conferences, that isn't necessarily a new fraud threat per se, but certainly, again, our increased dependency on those tools has increased their risk. And then we just see more phishing attacks in general as well.
I think to be fair to some of the video conferencing solutions, they never really set themselves up to be a 100% secure solution. And all of a sudden, sort of overnight, they found themselves being relied on for what really amounts to some very secure, sensitive information. These conference calls that could go on when people are forced to work remotely, all of a sudden have a very different feel to them than just, here's me trying to talk to my parents, or here's me trying to have a quick touch base with a member of my team. Now there's big strategy discussions that are going on through these platforms, and all of a sudden the security around them becomes really important. But I think there's a key word that you highlighted there, and it was vulnerable. One of the things which you talked about kind of before we pushed record here, fraudsters tend to kind of tackle the most vulnerable target that they can find. And in many cases, this appears to be especially cruel. On the individual level, these are people who can least afford to lose money or have their identity stolen. From a corporate level, it's kind of the same type of thing. What would you say to companies, if they're trying to sort of take themselves out of the crosshairs? How can I sort of not be the most vulnerable, not appear vulnerable, or put a target on my back?
So I agree. I think fraudsters are really quite heartless and they're not.
Sure, right. That's the line of work that you're in. I would hope so.
Exactly. They seek to attack the most vulnerable. And what you described before around, video conferencing tools and stuff, look, every organization is faced with that in terms of organizations are having to kind of reshape their operating models on the fly. There's also different situations, whether you're experiencing staffing shortages because you have a lot of sick employees or employees taking time off to care for their family members, or, you're just having to reshape your operating model because you have to accommodate this new normal with social distancing requirements or a remote workforce. So all that to be said is, I think these changes do make it challenging for companies to consistently adhere to some of their established controls that they have in place. And all of this creates an environment which makes it organizations more vulnerable to increased fraud attacks. I do think one of the key things to have organizations appear less vulnerable is to ensure that they're very thoughtful when they are introducing new changes to their operating models and to really try and abide by some of their established controls to the best extent possible, even during this pandemic.
We're going to come back to this question of what organizations can do to help protect themselves, because I think it's a really important one. But before we get there, I wanted to quickly just come back in and kind of, this is going to be difficult for you because you've got a lot of different types of fraud that you're aware of, but I'm going to ask you to pick just a couple. Which of the ones that we've talked about so far are sort of especially dangerous, especially scary right now? And I know they're all dangerous, they're all scary, but this is a podcast and I'm going to push you to give just one or two that seem really threatening to you at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. If I had to focus on one or two, I'd probably start with a fraud threat called imposter fraud, otherwise known as business email compromise, or the acronym BEC. BEC is where a fraudster can impersonate someone you trust, like a vendor or a company executive, and then they trick you into making a payment to them, oftentimes by sending an email from a hacked email account or a spoofed email account, and then they request a payment or changes to payment instructions. And then the person receiving the email, not realizing that the request is coming from a fraudster, is deceived into making the payment to a fraudulent account. So, we see that this type of risk is increasing during the pandemic because, again, companies may not be able to consistently adhere to standard operating controls, and fraudsters are taking advantage of the situation. So, as an example, if you've traditionally been paying a vendor by check, and then you receive an email from them asking you to pay them by ACH instead because they're having challenges with depositing checks in this environment. Now, that may seem like a perfectly reasonable request, but that type of account change request is actually one that's very typical of BEC fraud, and where a fraudster could potentially insert themselves and provide a fraudulent account number. And so it's really important in those types of situations that users are aware of that fraud risk and that they take the time to verify those payment requests.
Yeah, that's such a simple one, but so threatening, as you point out.
Yeah. And then the other one that I would mention really quickly is ransomware. Ransomware is where cyber criminals are able to lock up your systems and your data until you pay a large sum of money. these types of attacks are less common than VEC, but certainly on the rise during these recent times. And I think what's really interesting about ransomware is that historically, ransomware attacks, they generally involve smaller dollar amounts. But now I think fraudsters are requesting much larger ransom amounts, sometimes in the millions of dollars, because they realize exactly how vulnerable organizations are in this current environment and that they have the leverage to ask for a pretty significant payoff from companies.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a scary thought as well. I suppose it's a buyer's market or a seller's market, a ransomer's market, maybe is the appropriate way to put that. But either way, it's scary. So we promised that we would end with some tips on things that companies could do. I think we've sufficiently scared everybody now. Let's talk about what organizations can do to help try and prevent it. And some of them are just going to be simple steps, kind of adhering to best practices that you already know. I think the industry we already know we have to change passwords frequently. We have to look critically at emails. These are things that people know, and still we struggle, I think, as a group to adhere to those. But what else can companies do to protect themselves and their employees?
Well, I'm going to start by saying, first and foremost, education is absolutely key in combating fraud. So companies really should do everything that they can to ensure that all employees are aware of and on the lookout for common fraud risks. And in particular, especially during this time, increased phishing attacks. Because once somebody falls victim to a phishing attack, that can really lead to many different fraud outcomes, including, the ones that we talked about earlier, business email compromise, ransomware, account takeover, those types of things. And so it's really important during these times to avoid clicking on links or opening attachments from suspicious or unknown senders. And then the other recommendation I would offer is for organizations to strengthen their internal controls for payments. There's different ways to mitigate vulnerabilities for fraud. One suggestion, as an example, is the use of something called dual custody. And this basically involves having one person initiate a payment while a second person approves the payment on a different device. So you can see that provides some checks and balances to mitigate the fraud before it can happen. And so there's other types of internal controls that are leveraged by organizations in the same suit. One of them is actually very simple and established processes for verifying payment information to new vendors or changes to payment instructions. So we talked a little bit about the example earlier with a fraudster sending a fake request to submit future payments by ACH as opposed to check. And I think what's really important there is that you verify the payment information using different methods and where the original request came from. So as an example, if you receive a payment request through email, you really need to confirm that information by phone. And then you should really use the information you have for the contact on file and not the contact information contained in the original request. Because if that original request was fraudulent, you certainly don't want to be verifying that information directly with the fraudster.
Right. Yeah. That's the two-factor authentication kind of breaks down if it's really both going to the same source. Thanks so much, Jinee. Really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that. Obviously, a lot of really scary types of fraud out there right now, but it's good to know that there are some ways that corporations can protect themselves, that individuals can protect themselves. And, this is something that I'm sure we'll see quite a few innovators tackling as we get to our shows later on in 2020 with Finovate Fall coming up in September, Finovate West in November. I suspect that we will see quite a bit of security up on our stages at both of those shows. So for anybody who's interested in learning more, please do stay tuned to the Finovate space. In the meantime, Jinee, thank you so much again for joining me.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
The Finovate podcast is produced by Informa Connect in association with Provoke.fm Media. Check out Finovate.com for information on Finovate's upcoming shows and to learn how you can get involved. The discount code Finovate Podcast will save you 20% on tickets to all of our events. And you can email us at info@Finovate.com for information on sponsoring, speaking, or demoing. Thanks for listening.